Hello everyone. Welcome to Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on Complaint Handling in Compliance with FDA and ISO regulation. My name is Johnson and I'm going to be your host today. On behalf of our team, I would like to thank you for being part of this event. Today's webinar will be presented by Jeff Kassoff. Jeff Kassoff is the Director of Quality at Medivators, a leading manufacturer of endoscopy products. Among his responsibilities is oversight of the complaint handling system, including corrective action and complaint trending. Prior to this, Jeff spent 13 years at LifeTech as the Director of Regulatory Affairs, where he was responsible for regulatory compliance of the quality system. Jeff received his Regulatory Affairs certification in 1996. So we are really honored to have such a distinguished person such as Jeff with us to present this webinar. So before we begin, I would like to inform you about the program outlined for this training session. This webinar is for 60 minutes duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he would then share with you his presentation. We would like to inform you that all the participants, once part of the teleconference, have been placed on mute and will remain so until the question and answer begins toward the end of the webinar. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to me over the chat and we will get them addressed when the QA session is going on. We also request all to hold back your questions till the QA sessions then. And if for any reason you get logged out of this training session or the teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we are all ready to start, I request Jeff to take it from here. Jeff?
Introduction, Johnson. Let me welcome everybody to this webinar. For those who haven't attended webinars in the past, I really think that the only downside, the only detriment you're going to find is that, quite honestly, I can't see you and you can't see me. The way I like to address that is at the end in the Q&A session, I'm absolutely open to having more of a discussion, really, than just you asking me a question. If there's a specific comment you want to make, maybe about how you handle complaints at your particular company, more than happy to discuss that afterwards at the end of the webinar. If you think of a question, you can email the guys at Compliance Panel and they'll get in touch with me. In my mind, having been at many different types of companies, sizes that is, from a small startup where I was the first full-time employee after the inventors, to the company I'm at now, which is a several $100-million company, the thing that strikes me when it comes to complaint handling is that the FDA doesn't care how many complaints you get. If you're at a small company and you get a dozen, maybe a couple of dozen a month, that's easy. That's easy to completely document them and review them, close them in a timely manner. But if you're like I am and you're at a gigantic company where you get on average a couple of hundred complaints a month, you've still got to comply with the same regulations as does the small company. Just always something to leave in the back of your mind, not just complaints, in anything. The FDA never is interested how large your company is, which in some cases, in your opinion at least, may make it problematic for you to comply with a certain regulation entirely. The way I like to address, excuse me, the way I like to handle this webinar on complaint handling, no pun intended, is to begin with evolution of the complaint handling regulations, and then we'll define what a complaint is. Then I'm going to give you certain examples in which the definition is applied. I've attended some webinars, and you're going to find that this webinar may have some things you'd like to improve also, but when I do webinars, I make it a point not just to supply you with the regulations, or the regulatory definition that is, but also to give you certain examples, certain applications of the definition of the regulations. Then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about non-complaints. The handling of complaints begins with identification of the customer feedback as a complaint. So there are certain types of feedback that are not considered complaints. I'll cover some of those. Then we'll talk about what complaints must be from a procedural perspective. And then we'll talk about complaint investigation. Complaint handling is not just about writing down what the customer says, but it's also about investigating the problems that the customer reports. Then we'll talk about closing complaints. You've noticed here that the word closing is in quotation marks, and that's deliberate. Won't give you a spoiler alert, but I will explain why that is later. And then contents of a complaint form. I like to include in my webinars not just regulations and interpretations of the regulations, but based on my experience, what constitutes a good complaint form, what information needs to be at your fingertips, and what blanks need to be filled in to result in that information being at your fingertips. Then we'll talk about reviewing complaints and trending complaints, two different things. I will spend a few minutes talking about reportable events and reporting requirements. That is, events which, in most cases, involve a patient injury or a potential patient injury, but we'll speak more to that. And then the reporting requirements of how long, by what deadline you must report your reportable event and to whom. Complaint handling is required by both the FDA in the FDA&C Act and the European Community in ISO 13485. Complaint handling has always been a requirement from the first iteration of the GMPs, which is the QSR now, back in 1976, and the first iteration of ISO 13485, in which the 1996 version, the overwhelming majority of ISO 13485 just said, for example, Section 2.1, look at ISO 9001. Section 2.2, look at ISO 9001. The first iteration of ISO 13485 was maybe 7 or 8 pages total because it referenced exclusively ISO 9001. The reason I include this from an evolutionary perspective is because there are many sections of the regulations that have not always been a requirement. For example, looking at the domestic regulations, design control, there was always the implication that you needed to do validation, more than an implication actually, but the concept of design control and the explicit requirements of phases and things like that was not in the first iteration of 21 CFR 820. It came in the mid-'80s later on. Complaint handling is different in that complaint handling has always been the same requirement. The FDA has a tried and true process to evaluate your complaint handling. Nothing's changed. Now, it's been a while now since the mid-'80s, but it's even longer since the mid-'70s. And complaint handling is, unfortunately, cited regularly by both your FDA inspectors and your notified body auditors as deficient. The reason for this is because there are so many aspects of your quality system that complaint handling touches. Obviously, it deals with itself, which is the complaint handling requirements. But then you get, when you perform your investigations, you get into corrective and preventive actions. And based on that, you get into your validations, process validation, and then if your complaint results in a change, it gets into your change control procedures. So there's a lot of areas. I can't tell you to prepare for your complaint handling system to be dinged during your FDA or ISO audit. What I can tell you is that make sure that the deficiencies that they find are those that involve T's not being crossed or I's not being dotted, as opposed to, for example, forgetting to write the entire I and T themselves. The definition of the regulation is, domestically, it's a written, electronic, or oral communication. And the type of deficiency that alleges is identity, quality, durability, reliability, safety, effectiveness, or performance. And we'll cover that, but something I want you to look at is it's the device after it's released for distribution. And the ISO 13485 equivalent is that has been placed on the market. So just as an aside, I may mention this later, but I want to make sure to mention it now, is that if you have a distributor and you send your product to them, your product has not yet been released for distribution. This company distributes for you. They are an extension of your company. The ISO, as a comparison, the ISO regulation has written, electronic, or oral, just like the FDA regulation. And the types of deficiency that it alleges are identity, quality, durability, reliability, safety, or performance. You see what's missing. Effectiveness is explicitly missing from ISO 13485. Now, what this does not allow a company to do is to say, well, we don't sell to the states, so we're only ISO 13485 certified. Therefore, any complaints alleging issues of effectiveness are not considered a complaint. Any feedback that is alleging effectiveness is not a complaint. There are other areas that are still contained in the ISO 13485 definition that an auditor can say effectiveness needs to be included. Look at the concept of quality or durability or performance. Those all encompass so much of effectiveness that the absence of the word effectiveness in 13485 is, for all intents and purposes, completely insignificant. Now that we have the definition, we're going to apply the definition. So as you recall, in the previous slide, there were 3 types of definitions. You can see that: written, electronic, or oral. Now, some of these are more obvious. You know, for example, a written letter that your company might get. It might be a letter to your company or a note accompanying the returned item. These are, I don't want to call them gray areas. Heck, but I will. These are areas that are sometimes overlooked when it comes to complaint handling. For example, a letter comes to your company and it's just addressed to, let's say, my company, Medivators. All it says is Medivators and our street address. Where is it going to go? It's not going to come to the head of quality, or it might. Who knows? It's probably going to go, you know, the receptionist or the assistant who handles the mail will open it. He or she may have no idea what to do with that. So they might give it to the president or CEO. So that letter, once that is received by our company and it alleges a complaint, we'll talk about the types of complaints, types of deficiencies in a moment, that letter is a complaint. It has been sent to and obviously received by our company. Just because the receptionist or assistant misplaced it or the president or COO didn't know what to do with it, that still constitutes a complaint. And failure to comply with the complaint regulations with regard to that letter is a violation. A note accompanying a returned item. For those of you who have dealt in RMAs or RAs, return authorizations, return product to your company in receiving, you know that the best laid plans, contrary to the best laid plans, there are going to be times where a customer does not call in advance and request an RMA number to return an item. They get very frustrated and they say, you know what, send this back to Medivators. And it comes back without an RMA number, but luckily it has a note with it. And the note says, the efficacy of this product was not what I expected. Or maybe, if you're lucky, something more specific, such as the operating range didn't meet 70 millimeters of oxygen, for example. That note accompanying the returned item constitutes a complaint. And just because your receiving clerk was unaware of that and took that note and threw it away does not mean you're not violating, for the triple negative. That constitutes a complaint and still must be handled as a complaint. Electronically, email, obviously, any representation via email, if it contains what it needs to, if it alleges what it needs to with regard to a complaint, does constitute a complaint. Many of your people have email. There are some, there are some companies that have service at, let's say, medivators.com or customer service or R&D. Those are emails, and just because they're not sent to the appropriate people, they still constitute a complaint. Customer feedback on the company's website constitutes a complaint if it contains the required information. So your webmaster needs to understand what constitutes a complaint and what to do with that information. Oral is the third type of communication. The regulation states that it's to a company employee or a representative. The italics are mine. It's easy to know who your company's employees are. They get paid by your company. But many companies have representatives. A good example is during a clinical trial. Many companies contact a CRO, a clinical research organization, to work on their behalf and to monitor the clinical trial. Well, if a complaint comes from a clinical trial and that information is orally conveyed to that representative, that constitutes a complaint and must be treated as such. Another example of an oral complaint is if your company exhibits at a trade show and a doctor comes by, a physician end user comes by, and orally says something to one of the representatives. Maybe it's one of your salespeople, maybe it's one of your contract salespeople, independent sales operators, for example. They're representing your company at that exhibit, and they need to make sure that that is treated as a complaint. The quality system regulation says that oral complaints must be documented upon receipt. Now, it doesn't say immediately upon receipt. The implication, the importance of that statement is to underscore the fact that oral complaints are valid complaints. Just because they're not written doesn't make them any less significant. Now that we've looked at how the information is going to be conveyed to you, we're going to begin to look at the types of the deficiencies. The first thing is a deficiency of identity, in which the customer got the wrong device. They didn't get what they ordered. They ordered a 9 French catheter and they got a 7 French catheter. Now let's distinguish that, we'll talk about that this following during non-complaints, from the customer they got the right product, but they got the wrong quantity. That's not identity. Identity is what is the product they received. The type of deficiency of quality is pretty much a catch-all. I can't give you specific examples because product quality differs depending on what area you are. Maybe the packaging was bad, maybe the product didn't work, maybe it didn't work for as long as it was supposed to, maybe it didn't work for as many uses as it was supposed to. Usually when it comes to a durability complaint, it implies that the product was received damaged. Now, either UPS did it, or FedEx or somebody else, meaning the outside of the box is damaged, or the outside of the box is fine, but the product is damaged on the inside. Either of those constitute a complaint, usually durability type. In a reliability complaint, the product doesn't work for the duration as represented. Some products are used for 24-hour finite periods of time. Others are used for multiple uses. Either of those is a reliability issue. Now let's distinguish this, very important, from routine servicing in which the customer proactively sends their product back and says that, it's been 6 months, I'd like you to service my product. During servicing, your service department may find that the product wasn't working. That does not constitute a complaint. That is routine proactive servicing. A safety complaint will cover MDRs and reportable events later in the presentation. And in an effectiveness complaint, the product does not perform according to specifications. In my experience, the distinction between reliability and effectiveness deals quite a bit with whether it's a single-use device or whether it's a longer period device or a multiple-use device. Effectiveness is normally normally talked about when it comes to the single-use devices. And let me say one thing. This application of the definition is more for educational application, if you will, and less for hinting that you have to categorize your complaints. You don't, and I recommend you don't. If you receive a complaint that your product didn't work, and it gives specifics, of course, you don't need to wrestle with the determination of whether it's a reliability complaint or an effectiveness complaint. It is clearly a complaint, so make sure you treat it as such. Now that we've gone over the types of complaints and how you get them, there are several types of customer feedback that do not constitute complaints. Now, before I read them, let me tell you one thing, that in my experience of FDA inspections, I have been asked at least once by the FDA to show them my non-complaints, which is to say they looked at all of my complaints and they looked at them from a, soup to nuts perspective. They looked at everything and anything on those complaints. But the regulations educate me on how to classify feedback as to whether it's a complaint or not. So in order to comply with that, I must receive feedback that I determine, not must, but highly likely, that I receive feedback that does not constitute a complaint. So the FDA inspector asked me to see that. Well, fortunately, I did keep that information. Not just that, but we had a file in which my handwriting determined that particular types of feedback were not complaints. I will tell you one thing from a business perspective, you absolutely want to trend your non-complaints. You call it customer feedback, if you will. Now, you're not exposing yourself to the legal requirements of the quality system regulation, but from a marketing or in a continuous improvement perspective, customer feedback is very valuable into knowing what your customers expect or what they want in the next iteration of your product design, for example. So non-complaints, as I mentioned earlier, incorrect quantity. They got the right product, but they didn't get the right number. They got two pieces instead of 2 cases, for example. Incorrect shipment method. They wanted it overnight, but they got it 3rd day. Dissatisfaction with the company employee. Previously I worked at a company where the president and CEO is very particular to make sure that we documented every single type of customer feedback, not just product-specific feedback or service-specific feedback, but company employee-specific feedback. You'd be surprised how often the person in accounts receivable had non-complaints, I almost did it, written on them, because their job is to contact delinquent customers and ask them when they're going to pay. People don't like that. A request for a new feature. In this type of customer feedback, the customer says, well, I kind of wish you offered this additional aspect to your measuring system or something like that. And routine servicing, as I mentioned earlier, the proactive return or scheduled return of your product or request for one of your service techs to go on site. The first thing complaints have to be is complaints have to be received. You want to make sure that any negative feedback is documented. It's possible, but very challenging to educate people on what constitutes a complaint and what doesn't. Some of them quite obvious, others quite obvious on the other side, those that do not constitute complaints. But there's a large gray area, and if you've been around complaints long enough, you know that that gray area is longer than a novice would think it might be. Therefore, what you want to do is any of your people who may receive customer feedback should be trained to report any negative feedback. Let them know that it's not their responsibility to determine whether it constitutes a complaint or not. They just document the feedback and they forward it wherever they're supposed to forward it. Some firms have a complaint coordinator who has been trained to determine complaints from non-complaints. Other firms smaller firms have feedback forwarded to somebody in quality or regulatory management so that they're based on their expertise and training, they can make that determination. But the first line, the people who get the feedback, it shouldn't be their responsibility to determine whether it's a complaint or not. You want that responsibility to be centralized, because the FDA will ask to see those determinations and then ask to see the CV or training history of the person who makes or people who make that determination. As part of your training of these personnel, educate them on your complaint form, or if you have an electronic complaint form, same kind of thing. You also want to let them know that they've got to get enough information from the complainant about the problem they're alleging occurred. It is not acceptable. You need to train your people that it's not acceptable to document it doesn't work. If they get that from their person, from their complainant, they should ask for specifics. If their complainant is unable to give that, it's the responsibility of your company to get that information. However you choose to handle that is entirely up to you. Some examples I've seen are the person who receives the complaint asks for the name and phone number of the attending physician. Or I've seen companies take a less proactive approach and say, please call me back when you have this information. Let your people know what they're supposed to do with the complaint form. Do they send it to the complaint coordinator? Do they send it to the head of quality or regulatory? And also let them know something very important, that if there's a report, if the complaint includes a report of death or serious injury, or even any injury. We'll talk about the definition of serious injury as distinguished from regular injury later on. Let your people know any injury, any death, prior to processing. Don't just send the complaint form or send the email to the complaint coordinator. Call the complaint coordinator. Find them. Make sure that they, or maybe if they're not there, their boss knows that there was a report of a death or injury. You've got to take it very seriously. After complaints are received, they're reviewed. As I recommended, you want to have this centralized somewhere between a person or sub-department or whatever works for your company. Because if the feedback does not constitute a complaint by the regulatory definition, you've got to indicate that as such somewhere in the complaint form, including the rationale for a determination that does not constitute a complaint, and the signature of that person who makes that determination and the date they made that determination. After a complaint is reviewed, it's evaluated. Most companies I know have a formally designated unit, a complaint committee, a CAPA committee, something like that, that get together or meet periodically, maybe via email, maybe it's just a virtual meeting, but all of the complaints on a periodic basis are reviewed. And as part of the review, some of the things the department looks at is it a reportable event or is it MDR event? Was somebody injured or could they have been injured? And is an investigation necessary? If the investigation is necessary, to whom is the investigation assigned? Now you're getting it to corrective at your CAPA system. If not, why is no investigation necessary and who made the decision? And the reasons. Why is it that there is no investigation necessary? All complaints should be investigated. Having said that, if you have a complaint that is the exact same complaint as you received last week, and last week you received an item that you investigated and concluded the reason for, and for this current complaint you will receive no item, that's an investigation. You can point to the previous investigation to say that we already performed an investigation. Then next, complaints have to be investigated if it's determined that they have to be investigated. We'll talk about that shortly. After the investigation, complaints have to be processed in a uniform and timely manner. Later on, we'll talk about closing complaints. And as you may recall, on the outline slide, I had the word closing in quotation marks, much like I have the term uniform and timely manner. The concept of closing complaints is not defined in the regulations. Neither is a definition of uniform and timely manner. And complaints have to be kept. They have to be retained. You have to keep them either for the device life or 3 years, whichever is longer. 3 years is the usual device life for a consumable device, and I believe that's why the regulation states 3 years, or the expected device life for instruments, which is ordinarily much longer than 3 years. When it comes to investigating complaints, what your complaint report has to have a lot of information on it. You want to begin with the device name, the model number, and the lot and serial number to identify the specific device or devices that you are investigating, the date of the complaint receipt, and the complainant information, the name, address, and phone number, and the complaint specifics. Some firms have complaint numbers. And if you have a complaint number, you can refer to that number on your complaint investigation. Since that number provides a link to all of this information, you don't need this information. Although I do recommend, even if you have a complaint number, that you include the complaint specifics on your investigation record, because that's where you begin to perform your investigation. You don't need to know the device name or date of complaint receipt or specifics on the complainant, but you do need to know the complaint specific, what it was that the customer alleged. Then you're going to perform the investigation and document the investigation results. You're going to begin with a DOI, a design of investigation, which states what steps are you going to take, followed by the findings, which is what did you find out, what did you discover. After you document what you discovered, you're going to document the causes. and you're going to document the immediate cause and the root cause, Sometimes they are one and the same. Other times, not so much. If you determine during your investigation of a PC board that was returned that the resistors and capacitors were switched, that they were misassembled, that's the immediate cause. But the root cause, is why were they switched? Why did the operator make an error? Was it that they were not trained? Is it that you have a lot of that you've discovered during investigation, a lot of in-process errors made by multiple operators? Therefore, you could imply that the procedure is not that clear. Your complaint investigation, should then include what corrective action has been taken or will be taken. What many firms I know do on their investigation report is they document the corrective action that will be taken, and they document the ECO, or engineering change order, or DCO, or ECN, what have you, number, which, although the corrective action has not occurred yet, you've reserved yourself a engineering change document number that will contain the corrective action as it's taken, enabling a link to be provided from the investigation report to the corrective action. It is not required that you reply to the complainants. You don't have to get back to anybody ever to tell them what was wrong with their product. Now, do you want to? Absolutely. There are times where you definitely want to. Just as an aside, make sure that any information that your sales and marketing people know that any investigation report given to them may not be completely kosher to give to the end users. There may be proprietary or design-based information in that investigation report that is not acceptable to go outside to somebody who has not signed a non-disclosure agreement, for example. If your marketing people and salespeople want to reply to the complainant, have them contact the head of whichever department oversees investigation reports, and that person will sort of make a summary investigation report to be given to the end user. What I recommend you do is that if you have an indication that the complaint resulted from the device not being used per your labeling, that's a good time to limit and focus your replies to the complainants. Now, I can tell you, you've got to be kind of careful because doctors know everything. Hopefully no one attending this webinar is a doctor, because I am being sarcastic. But doctors think that they know everything. If you tell them that, hey, doc, you used this wrong. Look at section 12.1. Here's what it says, and here's in your complaint what you said. They don't like that. So craft your response carefully, but at the same time, that's a good time to let an end user know that they should pay a little more attention to the limitations for use or the process for you or the procedures for use of your device. Something that's often overlooked when it comes to complaint handling is the concept of applying risk assessment to complaint handling. And when it comes to risk assessment of a particular complaint, allegation, you want to make sure that that allegation, the occurrence of that allegation, has been previously accounted for during your design control risk management. When you perform your risk assessment early on and you state severity, likelihood, and detection, you're going to state all of those categories for each possible occurrence. If you have a particular occurrence, tip falling off, for example, that was not accounted for during that design control risk management up front during your design phase, it's your company's responsibility to go ahead and change that risk assessment, to modify that risk assessment. What we do here is once a product is released, we take that risk assessment and we implement it into our document control system. So it becomes revision A of risk assessment for product 123. So when we receive a complaint on product 123, which alleges that the tip fell off, and that's not been accounted for in the risk assessment, we modify the risk assessment and have it approved and submit it as Rev B in our document control system. And that way, we know for sure that the risk has been adequately accounted for and mitigated. Risk assessment should be used for one more thing, and it should be used to determine whether risk posed by the occurrence, by the recurrence of this event requires field action. And obviously, detectability is not an issue here because you've had a report on the complaint. What you graph here is severity and likelihood on the X and Y axes. And you set yourself up with a preset action limit which determines whether field action is required. This is an example of the graph that I've seen used in the past. Likelihood, severity, as you can see, in 0 through 5. And their severity runs the range from no effect on functionality and no effect on safety. So there's pretty much no effect here, all the way down to occurrence could result in serious injury or death, not requiring you to use these severity and likelihood categories, but I can tell you that I've used them in the past for many years, and both regulatory agencies, domestic and international, excuse me, have looked at this, and I've not been cited for it, any sort of noncompliance or inadequacy in the past. Likelihood runs the gamut from no chance of recurrence. This will not happen. I can tell you I can tell you that I can't tell you whether I've ever put a likelihood of 0 before. And then 5 is it will occur, 100% certainty that it will occur. And as you can see, there's an area of unacceptable risk in which that risk requires us to take field action. Now, that type of field action is going to be determined by, our material review board, but we're required to take some field action. Also, any point that falls exactly on the division line, for example, a severity 2, likelihood 4, does not require, it is considered to be acceptable risk. A point must be completely contained in unacceptable risk to be an unacceptable risk, which again requires some sort of field action. When it comes to closing complaints, here's the famous quotation marks I've referenced several times. As I said, there's no definition anywhere of what it means to close a complaint, but you've got to make sure that how you define it at your company is documented in your complaint system documentation, in your SOP or procedure for complaint handling. There are 4 options. The first option is a firm that determines that their complaints are closed once they assign an investigation. So once my complaint committee determines that Jeff Kassoff is assigned this investigation, boom, that complaint is closed. However, you've got to update that status somewhere until all of that corrective action is completed. There needs to be a link between that complaint being closed once I've been assigned an investigation and what my investigation documented and what the corrective action and validations and document changes implied in it were. Firms that do this will assign investigation numbers, and that's how they track that. The second option for closing complaints is once the investigation is completed. So my complaint is closed once I have completed my investigation and documented it, reported upon it, and the complaint committee has accepted my report of investigation. A third option is a complaint can be considered to be closed once corrective action has been determined. So I have completed my investigation, and I or a committee or whoever determines what corrective action will be performed, that's been documented on my investigation report. And firms that do this, again, similar to the one above, as you can see with the asterisk, if you determine that your complaints are closed based upon knowing what your corrective action is going to be, you've got to provide a link from that corrective action from the complaint, to the corrective action that will subsequently be performed. As some firms provide investigation numbers, other firms provide corrective action numbers. I can tell you there are far fewer corrective actions done than investigations. And lastly, the last type of firm will determine that their complaints are closed based on completion of the corrective action. At this point, every single thing is done. The investigation has been assigned and completed. The corrective action has been determined and completed. And documents changed, for example, if it's a process change, a manufacturing process, or a first article inspection drawing, those documents have been changed. That's when the corrective action is completed. I can tell you, though, that what you've got to weigh completeness with the concept of timeliness. I don't like to call it timeliness. I like to call it the concept of timeliness. There's no definition of timeliness. I recommend you not define it in your procedure. But I can tell you from personal experience that if you choose the fourth category here, you are setting yourself up to be cited by FDA for a lack of timely complaint closure. The one I prefer, having tried most of these, is the third one. I like to close my complaints based upon the determination of corrective action because my investigation is completed, and I may know, for example, that we don't need to take corrective action because this was an isolated occurrence. My complaint is closed. Or I may determine, you know what, we're getting a trend now of complaints, and we need to perform a corrective action. And based on the investigation, here's what that corrective action is going to be, and here's the ECO number or CAR, corrective action request number. So I can link it that way. On the complaint form, and I've been through dozens of complaint forms in my life, I prefer complaint forms that contain quite a bit of meat on them. There's a lot of information on the complaint form because in my experience what you sometimes have is senior management has heard from the field about some complaints, in many cases the director or VP of sales or marketing, and they want to look at some complaints to see what's going on. The more information you have on a complaint form, the more they can understand, just from a political perspective, if no more than that. It begins with the customer information, which is the name, contact, and phone number, address, email. How to get in touch with them. You don't need phone number, address, and email. Just some way to get in touch with them and to distinguish them from other similarly or identically named facilities. There are many Mercy hospitals in the country. Well, you may want to have the address for that one. When it comes to customer information, many firms have customer numbers. You want to put that here also. That enables a really good sorting mechanism for being able to determine which of your customers has lodged which complaints or how many complaints. The second section of the complaint form is the part information. The part number and description, the lot or serial number. Some firms with multiple product lines like to be able to sort their complaints by product line. Some firms like to use sales order or RMA number. What I recommend is that on each of your complaints, you have at least one of these. If a product is coming back, if you have an RMA number that you are issuing, return merchandise authorization that is, that product is coming back. It doesn't matter what sales order you sold it on, but you're going to be able to perform an investigation on that exact product, priceless. However, if the product's been thrown away, you will need to know the sales order number that was sold on, because many firms document on their sales order the product number or, well, product number of course, but lot number that the product that was sold on that product. Or maybe if you don't have a lot number, you know the date, and you can see the date if you have an electronic MRP system, you can find out the date that that product was pulled from stock and kind of approximate the lot number to enable you to perform a investigation of a document review and complaint review. In any of these firms, nowhere in any of these fields should NA appear. NA can mean many things, the least of which is unavailable or not available, or not applicable. These two words have completely different meanings. They're not similar at all. If you're looking for a lot or serial number of a product that is not lot or serial controlled, maybe an accessory, a 2-foot cable, for example, the field information for lot serial number for that product is not applicable. But if it does have a lot, that product, if you're selling a product, if you have a product that has a complaint on it, and it does have a lot number, but the customer doesn't have it, that lot number is unavailable. So during your training, as I mentioned earlier, train everybody who can take feedback. Let them know, no NAs, unavailable or not applicable. The next section of the complaint form is the event-specific information. The classification of the event, how would you classify the event that occurred? Did it occur during use on a patient or during an initial use or reuse? And did a serious injury or death occur? If the answer is yes, that becomes an MDR event. As I said, we'll cover that later in the presentation. And a detailed, keyword detailed, explanation of the problem. When you train your people on how to take complaints, make sure you train them also on being able to distinguish what information should go on a complaint. The key is a detailed explanation of the problem, not a detailed explanation of what the customer thinks about the quality of products sold by your company. That doesn't go on a complaint form. And hopefully a lot of you are thinking, well, that's a no-brainer, but I can tell you that I've seen dozens and dozens of salespeople try to use the complaint form as a tool for feedback, to get things done, to get technical people, the design people and engineers, for example, in production, to look at something. So limit the detailed explanation to the problem that is at hand. Any further information on the complaint form, I like to include the determination of complaint right there on the form. It's pretty straightforward. And an investigation requirement. Is an investigation required? And if so, to whom has it been assigned? I like to have this in a complaint form because it's a central location to record everything that's going to happen to this complaint. Just a second, please. Now that we have complaints, they've been documented, you need to handle them in two manners. You need to review them. What I recommend you have is a multi-departmental periodic meeting, weekly, twice a month, once a month, every other month. That's completely up to you, based on the quantity of complaints you get, people availability, things like that. Definitely make sure that sales has a representative at this multi-departmental meeting. Because what salespeople tend to do is focus on the customers who squawk the loudest. And what we need to do from a review perspective and a trend perspective, we'll look at that momentarily, is let them know, well, sure, your customer number 1, 2, 3 is squawking the most, but as you can see, they're the only one who has ever had this problem. At this meeting, you want to update the status of complaints. What you want to have is open, closed, or awaiting return of product. That's all you really need to do. It's just a status update. There are going to be times where your company issues an RMA to a customer for return of product, and after some period of time, just hasn't come back yet. Well, you can ignore it, but what I recommend you do, since you've got to close your complaints in a timely manner, is charge customer service with the responsibility of contacting the customer and saying, hi, it's Joan from customer service at Medvators. Calling to follow up on the return status of RMA number 678. What's going on with that? And many times the customer, the purchasing agent or whoever is at the facility might say, oh, I'm sorry, I have it right here. We'll get it in the mail. But there are going to be times where they don't mean that. And they say, oh, it's right here. I'm going to send it. And then some period of time later, you call them back to say what's going on with that. And they don't know. And then you have to call them back. And they say, oh, we threw it out. I like the 3 strikes you're out rule. We give 3 attempts to return product, and as part of the third one, which is usually an email so we can have that in writing, we explain that this is going to be our last attempt to recover this, to have this item returned to us. After this, we're going to consider it to be not returned, and we're going to proceed otherwise with our investigation. The status of the investigations, you might want to consider look at that at your periodic review meeting. And closing complaints on the minutes. There should be a document that comes out of your complaint committee meeting, and it should document whether complaints are closed. You don't have to do this, but it's an easy central location for the small to medium-sized company to provide one location that states the status on a month-by-month basis of all your complaints. Well, complaints are certainly reviewed on a complaint-by-complaint basis, but they're also trended on a larger scale. Different firms choose to trend in different manners or combinations thereof. Some companies choose to trend bi-monthly, not bi-monthly. They choose to trend in a monthly manner. They choose to trend by model. Normally what you see is a period of time, maybe monthly, for example, by model. So model 1 had this many complaints. Here were the failure modes. Model 2 this, 3 this, et cetera, et cetera. Some firms, from a business perspective, trend closure duration. How long does it take us to close complaints? It's something that we want to know. If you want to set up a KPI, a key performance indicator for your firm, this is a good way to start. And as part of trending, make sure you publish that trending for review. Most firms will have a complaint trend at their executive management review, and that's a great idea. That's a good way to do that. Now that we've covered the good complaints, let's call them the less dangerous complaints. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about reportable events, beginning with domestically, an MDR event, a medical device reportable event. This is an event that suggests, notice the word here is suggests. You are not admitting guilt when you file an MDR. All you're saying is that your device was being used and something happened to somebody. Well, it's a little more than that, but the way the regulation is written, depending on the nature of the injury, that's really what you're going to do. So if you can try to find a way out of the first bullet point here, I would certainly wish you luck, because your device may have caused or contributed to a death or serious injury. So the concept of caused or contributed was that the death or serious injury was or may have been attributed to the device, or that your device was or may have been a factor. It's very rare that you can conclude without some kind of investigation that your device did not possibly, even with the remotest chance, cause or contribute to a death or serious injury. That's why many people choose to err on the side of conservatism here, which is our device was being used, something happened to somebody, and we're going to file an MDR. We talked about a serious injury here, and a serious injury is one that is life-threatening, results in permanent impairment, or requires medical intervention, to avoid permanent impairment. And the word permanent is further defined as irreversible. So if something happens to somebody, it's lowercase I that's going to clue you in onto how to handle, sorry about that, your MDR reportable event. However, even if nothing happens to a patient, you can still have an MDR event. In this scenario, your device malfunctions. It just didn't work. But in your opinion, if that malfunction were to recur, it would be likely to cause or contribute to a death or serious injury. So there's a standard of likelihood there, of inevitability, which early on, if somebody gets hurt or dies, if there's any remote chance that your device was involved, you've got to file an MDR. But if nothing happened except for a malfunction, but it's kind of a serious malfunction, the standard of likelihood has to be, it has to be likely that your device would cause or contributed to death or serious injury. Internationally, in the European community, you've got to notify the competent authority immediately upon being told of either of these things. Either your device malfunctions, or, I'm going to read this part, any inadequacy in the labeling or IFUs which might lead to or has led, sorry about the misspelling there, to a death or serious injury. The difference here from the domestic MDR event is now the cause of the event, if it's caused by labeling or IFU inadequacy, that is a reportable event. Also, any reason with device performance that leads to a recall. So if you have an international European, an EU recall, then the event is by definition a reportable one. Domestically, when you have an MDR, in case of death, you've got to submit the report to the FDA within 5 workdays, and the regulation is very, very helpful. I've submitted a few MDRs in my day, and the regulation really walks you through step by step, as does Form 3500A. As far as what to fill in, there are certain fields that you need to complete. It walks you through them. Very, very helpful. In all other cases, which is the lower bullet, the serious injury, or the lowercase 2, as we talked about earlier right there, if it recurs, it would be likely to cause. You have 30 calendar days. Just the distinction here between work days and calendar days. 5 work days is a week. 30 calendar days is a month. Just wanted to point out the distinction here between the two. Same form in all of the cases as in the cases of death. In the per the medical device directive in the EU, you've got 2 days to report an event that requires remedial action, which, as you can see below, is an action involving products already in the field, like taking them off the market, to prevent an unreasonable risk of substantial harm to the public health. I don't know anybody in medical devices. Obviously, I don't know everybody in medical devices, but I don't know anybody who has ever filed a 2-day EU competent authority report, because there's unreasonable risk, which means that a reasonable risk does not require this, assuming that there is such a thing, and substantial harm. Well, you know what, Mr. Notified Body Order, we determined that the harm was minimal at best. That's why we did not file a 2-day report. However, a 10-day report is death, serious injury, malfunction. So those 3 things are all piled together in the same category in the European Union, not as contradictory to here in the States. Both of these types, the 2-day and the 10-day, in the medical device directive, they say immediately, but not later than 2 or 10 days. I don't know why they say that, because it's difficult to hold anybody to a standard of immediacy. And I've also included a website which contains the list of competent authorities depending on the country that you're speaking of. So, in summary, make sure complaints have to be documented no matter who gets them, whether it's your CEO, his receptionist, assistant, or the receiving clerk. Train everybody who can receive any type of contact with the outside world, quite honestly. You can't really ever train too many people. I've worked at companies where the president has requested that the CFO be trained, because CFOs talk to people. It's not a problem. You can't over-educate. Complaints have got to be processed immediately. Whoever takes the complaint needs to be trained and needs to know exactly what to do and where to send the complaint forms and how to document the complaint forms. Immediately after they're forwarded, complaints should be reviewed by a responsible and trained, and make sure that training is documented, individual. Is the feedback a complaint? Is the complaint reportable? And to whom is the investigation assigned? Complaints should be statused frequently. You shouldn't ever lose visibility. You shouldn't, which is a good reason why if you trend your complaint closure, then it's a good idea to go ahead and handle it that way. And document the status review also so everyone is aware of what's going on. Complaints have got to be closed in a timely manner. You define what timeliness is. Actually, don't define what timeliness is, but track and trend how long it takes you to close complaints. Anecdotally, 30-day is a good goal. In practice, 60-day is a good maximum goal. You would, if it were only up to your firm, you could do 30 days. But there are so many times where you need external companies involved. If an RMA has been issued, you have to wait for that. If your investigation determines that a particular component that you purchase is at fault and you issue a supplier corrective action request to the supplier of that component, you've got to wait some time. That's why 30 days might not be a reasonable goal. And trend complaints regularly. Your firm will be in an operation of continuous improvement if you can trend your complaints and take corrective actions to eliminate those complaints that occur the most frequently, And once those are eliminated, then you have your second tier of complaints, and eventually, due to continuous improvement, you're always eliminating complaints and improving profitability. That's the end of the presentation, so I think if the moderator's back, we can go ahead and start our Q&A session.
Thank you, Jeff, for the wonderful presentation, and also all the participants for cooperating with us. So it's time for Q&A session to begin, and let me inform our participant the best way to ask your question is you can just click on palm-like icon, which is on your panel, as you can see next to my name at this moment, and I will open your line so that you can ask your question directly with Jeff. And that's one way. Another way, you can send your question to me over the chat, and I shall pass it on to our presenter to answer it. Meanwhile, we sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will appear on your screen in the polling panel shortly. The feedback form has just 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it will not take more than 2 minutes of time to answer. The polling will remain open till the end of the session, and you can answer it even after the QA is over. We would be grateful if you could stay back a little longer and complete this feedback for us. So, dear attendees, we are open for your questions. Please feel free to send your questions to me. At this moment, Jeff, I'm not seeing any questions coming up. Maybe we'll give them a few more seconds if they're coming up with any questions.
Okay.
Yes, I have one question from Angelina. I'll pass it on to you over the chat. Please have a look over it and clarify the same. I'm sending it to you. One moment, please. Yes, Jeff, I have sent it to you over chat.
Okay, the question is, excuse me, what are the qualifications of a complaint coordinator? Well, a complaint coordinator should absolutely be trained in the FDA and the European Union complaint handling requirements, in addition to which he or she should be trained in what constitutes a complaint and the best forms and most effective forms in how to document that complaint. So, to summarize, primarily education by FDA and European Union into what constitutes a complaint to enable them to coordinate and handle those complaints. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Dear attendees, please feel free to ask your question if you have any. Maybe we'll give them another 5 to 6 seconds, Jeff, to see if they are coming up with any question.
Sounds great.
And meanwhile, dear attendees, the polling is open, so I would request you to start giving your feedback because it will be of great help at our end to ensure that you're getting the best possible service. Okay, Jeff, so I'm not seeing any questions coming up, so do you have any concluding remarks from your end?
I don't. All I want to say is that the key to good complaint handling and good complaint closure is training. That's all.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jeff. So we are grateful to all of you for having taken part in this webinar. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email at the contact details which are on your screen at this moment. If any of you feel that your team members, colleagues, friends might benefit from this webinar, we are happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format also and can be purchased from our website. You can just get in touch with our customer support at the given number on your screen. I would also like to take this opportunity to let our attendees know about the upcoming webinars from Jeff Kassoff. So if you need more details about these, you can either visit our website or call us at our customer support, and definitely we will assist you on that. We welcome your suggestions and feedback or ideas on how we can improve our webinars. If you would like to suggest a topic or desire a customized corporate training online or on-site, we ensure that whatever is your training necessity, it will be our priority. So we look forward to having you with us again sometime soon and for a continued patronage. On behalf of our presenter Jeff Kassoff and the Global Compliance Panel team, I would like to say thank you for participating in this webinar and we wish you a pleasant day ahead.